The morning sun of June 4, 1942, cast long shadows across the flight deck of the aircraft carrier. Akagi, as Admiral Kiichi Nagumo, gazed through his binoculars at the seemingly empty Pacific horizon. The salt-tinged breeze carried with it the confidence of 6 months of unbroken victory. Yet something felt different about this dawn. Behind him, the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled by the Imperial Japanese Navy spread across the ocean like a steel constellation for fleet carriers. 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, all bearing the rising sun banner toward what High Command believed would be another easy conquest. "Sir, reconnaissance aircraft report no enemy activity in the target area," Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda reported, his voice carrying the crisp efficiency that had made him one of Japan's most respected naval aviators. The architect of the Pearl Harbor attack stood at attention, his uniform immaculate despite the humid morning air. Around them, the organized chaos of preparing for battle filled the carrier's deck as mechanics performed final checks on Type 0 fighters and Nakajima torpedo bombers. Nagumo nodded, but his weathered face betrayed none of the satisfaction his subordinates expected. At 55, the veteran admiral had earned his reputation through careful calculation rather than reckless bravado, and something about this operation troubled him. The plan, conceived by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself, called for a decisive blow against the American Pacific Fleet by drawing them into a trap at Midway Atoll. Yet intelligence reports remained frustratingly vague about American fleet movements, and the tight operational schedule left little room for the thorough reconnaissance that Nagumo preferred. 240 miles to the northeast, aboard the USS Enterprise, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance studied the same dawn through different eyes. The 55-year-old American commander, thrust into this crucial battle due to Admiral William Halsey's hospitalization, possessed a calm, analytical mind that had earned him respect throughout the Navy. Unlike his more flamboyant colleagues, Spruance approached warfare like a complex mathematical equation, weighing variables and calculating probabilities with methodical precision. "Intelligence indicates the Japanese fleet is approaching from the northwest," reported his chief of staff, Captain Miles Browning, spreading reconnaissance photographs across the chart table. "Codebreakers have given us their approximate position in composition." The breakthrough in Japanese naval codes achieved through painstaking work by cryptographers at Pearl Harbor had provided the Americans with an unprecedented advantage. They knew not only that the Japanese were coming, but exactly when and how they planned to strike, as reported by historian Gordon Prange in his definitive account Miracle at Midway. The American position at this crucial moment represented a remarkable reversal of the intelligence warfare that had favored Japan since Pearl Harbor. The two fleets, separated by hundreds of miles of ocean, embodied different philosophies of naval warfare. The Japanese force represented the culmination of their carrier doctrine, built around the concept of decisive battle through overwhelming air power concentrated in a single thrust. Their pilots, veterans of campaigns from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, flew with the confidence of an undefeated air force. The Akagi, Kaga, Haryu, and Soryu carried between them over 270 aircraft, operated by crews who had honed their skills through months of continuous combat. The American fleet, by contrast, operated under the shadow of recent defeats and the weight of desperate necessity. Task Force 16, built around the Enterprise and Hornet, and Task Force 17, centered on the hastily repaired Yorktown, carried fewer aircraft operated by pilots with limited combat experience. Yet what they lacked in experience, they possessed in determination and the invaluable advantage of fighting on terms of their own choosing. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the course of the Pacific War, though neither commander fully grasped the magnitude of the forces they were about to unleash upon each other. The attack began exactly as Admiral Yamamoto had planned. At 4:30 in the morning on June 4, 1942, the first wave of Japanese aircraft launched from the 4 carriers of the Kido Butai, their engines creating a thunderous symphony that echoed across the Pacific. 108 planes, 36 Nakajima torpedo bombers, 36 Aichi dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters formed up in the pre-dawn darkness and set course for Midway Atoll, their navigation lights creating moving constellations. Against the star-filled sky, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, leading the strike force, felt the familiar surge of confidence that had carried Japanese naval aviation to victory after victory. At 29, he had already participated in attacks on Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and Ceylon, earning a reputation as one of the Navy's most capable squadron leaders. As his formation approached the tiny atoll, he could see the distinctive outline of Sand Island and Eastern Island growing larger through the morning haze. The attack on Midway itself proceeded with devastating efficiency. Japanese bombs and torpedoes reduced fuel tanks to blazing infernos, shattered the runway on Eastern Island, and left the small American garrison reeling under the assault. Marine Captain Marion Carl, commanding Fighter Squadron 221, led his obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters in a desperate defense. But the superior speed and maneuverability of the Zeros quickly told. Within minutes, 15 of the 27 Marine aircraft were shot down, their pilots paying the ultimate price for their courage. Yet even as Tominaga's bombers wreaked havoc on the installations below, something unexpected was happening. The American response came not from Midway's battered airfield, but from the empty ocean to the northeast. At 6:02 in the morning, APBY Catalina flying boat piloted by Ensign Jack Reed spotted the Japanese fleet and transmitted the message that would change everything. Enemy carriers bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles. Aboard the Enterprise, Admiral Spruance received the sighting report with the calm demeanor that would become legendary. The intelligence breakthrough had worked perfectly. The Japanese were exactly where the codebreakers had predicted they would be. Launch the attack, he ordered quietly, and within minutes, the American carriers began launching every available aircraft. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise Air Group 6, took off at 7:02 with 37 dive bombers, knowing that he was flying toward the most important mission of his career. Behind him came torpedo squadrons from all three American carriers, their obsolete Douglas Devastator aircraft carrying the slim hope of crippling the Japanese fleet before it could launch a second strike. The Japanese response revealed the first cracks in their seemingly perfect plan. Tominaga's radio message from over Midway requested a second attack on the island's installations, catching Admiral Nagumo in a moment of crucial indecision. His aircraft were armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for anti-ship work, prepared for the American fleet that intelligence suggested might appear. Rearming them for a second land attack would take precious time and leave his carriers vulnerable. The decision to rearm proved to be the pivot point upon which the entire battle would turn. As Japanese ordnance crews worked frantically to switch weapons, Scout Plane No. 4 from the cruiser Tone, launched 30 minutes late due to mechanical problems, finally reported what Nagumo had been dreading. Enemy fleet bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles. The message sent shockwaves through the Japanese command structure. The American Pacific Fleet, supposedly scattered and demoralized after months of defeats, had somehow positioned itself perfectly to intercept the Kido Butte, even more alarming. Follow-up reports indicated the presence of at least one aircraft carrier among the American forces. Nagumo faced an impossible choice. His first strike force was returning from Midway, low on fuel and requiring immediate landing. His second-wave aircraft were caught in the middle of rearming, their decks cluttered with ordnance and fuel lines. The American fleet was closing rapidly, and every minute of delay increased the danger to his irreplaceable carriers. The Admiral's long experience in naval warfare told him that his carefully orchestrated plan was beginning to unravel, but the magnitude of the intelligence failure had not yet become clear. The Americans had not stumbled upon his fleet by chance. They had been waiting for him, positioned with mathematical precision to exploit the weaknesses in Japanese operational planning that 6 months of easy victories had concealed. At 9:25 on the morning of June 4, 1942, the first wave of American attackers found the Japanese fleet exactly where intelligence had predicted. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, approached the Kido Butai with the grim determination of men who understood they were flying obsolete aircraft against overwhelming odds. The 15 Douglas, Devastator, torpedo bombers, lumbering through the sky at barely 100 knots, represented the cutting edge of American naval aviation just 2 years earlier. Now they were flying coffins against the most experienced naval air force in the world. The slaughter was methodical and complete. 0 fighters, led by experienced aces like Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, tore through the torpedo planes with devastating efficiency. The Devastators, forced to fly straight and level during their torpedo runs, became easy targets for the superior Japanese fighters. Within minutes, 14 of the 15 aircraft were burning wrecks scattered across the Pacific, their crews joining the growing number of American heroes who had paid the ultimate price for their country. Ensign George Gay, sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, floated in his life raft among the debris of his squadron. Watching the battle unfold from a unique and terrifying perspective, his account would later provide historians with an eyewitness view of the moment when American sacrifice began to turn the tide of war. The pattern repeated itself with heartbreaking regularity. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, pressed home their attack with equal courage and suffered similar casualties. Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown, under Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, completed the trilogy of heroic futility as 0 fighters and anti-aircraft fire decimated their formation. Yet the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons achieved something that no American commander had dared hope for. The low-level attacks had drawn the entire Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches undefended. More critically, the timing of the attacks had caught the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment, with returning aircraft from the Midway strike circling overhead, waiting to land on decks cluttered with refueling and rearming operations. Admiral Nagumo, standing on the bridge of the Akagi, watched the last American torpedo plane disappear beneath the waves and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. His fleet had survived 3 separate torpedo attacks without significant damage. While American losses mounted catastrophically, the vaunted American Navy appeared to be repeating the same tactical mistakes that had led to disaster after disaster since Pearl Harbor. According to naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive study, History of United States Naval Operations. In World War II, Japanese command structure at this moment reflected dangerous overconfidence that would prove fatal within the hour. The Japanese flight decks presented a scene of organized chaos as crews worked to prepare the second strike force. Fuel lines snaked across the Akagi's deck, connecting aircraft to underground storage tanks. Ordnance carts loaded with armor-piercing bombs and aerial torpedoes waited in neat rows, ready to be loaded into the bellies of waiting bombers. The precision that had made Japanese naval aviation legendary was evident in every movement. Yet the very efficiency of the operation created vulnerabilities that American planners had spent months learning to exploit. At 10:24, Lieutenant Nee, Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 37 dive bombers from the Enterprise, finally spotted the Japanese fleet after nearly running out of fuel in a fruitless search. His decision to follow the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin the main fleet had led him to the exact position where American intelligence had predicted the carriers would be. As he pushed over into his attack dive, targeting the Akagi, McCluskey could see the flight deck crowded with aircraft fuel lines and ordnance. Perfect target for dive bombing attack. The moment of truth had arrived, though neither McCluskey nor Nagumo fully grasped that the next few minutes would determine the outcome of the Pacific War. At 10:26 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, the sky above the Japanese fleet suddenly filled with American dive bombers. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's Enterprise squadrons and Lieutenant McCluskey Yorktown Group had arrived simultaneously at the target. Their approach undetected by Japanese radar operators focused on the sea-level torpedo attacks that had just concluded. The timing was beyond perfect. It was miraculous. Admiral Nagumo had just ordered his fleet to turn northeast to close the distance with the reported American carriers. bringing his ships into a neat formation that presented ideal targets for dive-bombing attack. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were caught with their flight decks packed with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance. While their combat air patrol struggled to climb back to altitude after decimating the American torpedo squadrons, Lieutenant Richard Best, leading 3 SBD Dauntless dive bombers in an attack on the Akagi, pushed over into his dive at 14,000 feet. The carrier growing larger in his bomb sight with each passing second. The flagship of the Kido Butai presented a perfect target, her flight deck crowded with Type 0 fighters and Nakajima bombers being prepared for launch. Best's 1,000-pound bomb, released at 2,000 feet, struck the flight deck near the island's superstructure with devastating effect. Explosion ripped through the Akagi's wooden flight deck and detonated among the aircraft and ordnance below. Within seconds, the flagship that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor was transformed into a blazing inferno. Fuel fires spread rapidly through the hangar deck, while secondary explosions from stored ordnance turned the ship into a floating volcano. Admiral Nagumo, thrown to the deck of his bridge by the blast, struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster unfolding around him. The careful precision of Japanese naval operations had been replaced by chaos and terror as his flagship burned beneath his feet. Damage control parties fought desperately to contain the fires, but the ship's wooden construction and the presence of aviation fuel made their efforts futile. Simultaneously, dive bombers from Scouting Squadron 6 targeted the Kaga, the veteran carrier that had served as the backbone of Japanese naval aviation since the late 1920s. For direct hits transformed the ship into another floating pyre, her flight deck erupting in explosions that could be seen for miles across the Pacific. Captain Jisaku Okada, commanding the Kaga, died at his post as his ship burned around him. The Soryu, smallest of the Japanese fleet carriers, suffered perhaps the most devastating attack of all. 3 bombs from Lieutenant Commander Leslie's squadron struck within minutes, starting fires that quickly spread throughout the ship. The carrier's tight construction, designed for maximum aircraft capacity, became a liability as flames raced. Through cramped compartments and passages, in the space of 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were burning wrecks. Their flight decks twisted metal, and their aircraft reduced to scattered debris. The cream of Japanese naval aviation pilots, who had trained for years and accumulated hundreds of hours of combat experience, died in the flames, or were trapped below decks as their ships became floating crematoriums. Captain Taman Yamaguchi, commanding the Hiryu and the 2nd Carrier Division, watched in horror as the backbone of Japanese naval air power was destroyed before his eyes. The 50-year-old veteran is considered one of the most promising admirals in the Imperial Navy. Realized that the burden of continuing the fight now rested entirely on his single remaining carrier. Yamaguchi's response revealed both the fighting spirit and the tactical blindness that characterized Japanese naval doctrine. Rather than withdrawing to preserve his ship and remaining aircraft, he immediately ordered preparation of a counterattack against the American fleet. His decision reflected the deep-seated Japanese belief that decisive battle, regardless of odds, was preferable to strategic retreat. The psychological impact of the disaster extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Japanese naval aviation had suffered its first major defeat, and the myth of invincibility that had sustained the expanding empire was shattered in those 5 terrible minutes. Pilots and aircrew who had believed themselves part of an unstoppable force suddenly found themselves fighting for survival rather than conquest. Radio messages from the burning carriers painted a picture of unprecedented catastrophe. Akagi hit and burning, reported one transmission. Kaga heavily damaged and unable to launch aircraft, came another. The clinical language of naval communications could not convey the human cost of the disaster. Hundreds of irreplaceable pilots and aircrew consumed by the fires their own weapons had helped create. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato, 300 miles to the west, received the devastating reports with the stoic calm that had made him legendary throughout. The Japanese Navy, Yet even his iron composure could not mask the magnitude of the strategic disaster that was unfolding. The Hiryu steamed through the afternoon smoke of June 4th, 1942. As the sole survivor of the once mighty Kido Butai, Captain Taman Yamaguchi stood on his bridge, surveying the burning hulks that had been the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy just hours before. The acrid smell of burning fuel and metal carried across the water, a funeral pyre for Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. Yamaguchi, known throughout the fleet for his aggressive tactics and innovative thinking, refused to accept defeat. At 50, he represented the new generation of Japanese naval officers who had embraced carrier aviation as the future of naval warfare. His decision to launch an immediate counterattack with his remaining aircraft reflected both personal courage and the dangerous inflexibility that had become embedded in Japanese tactical doctrine. At 11:05, 18 Aichi dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters launched from the Hiryu's deck, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. The formation climbed steadily through the afternoon sky, their pilots grimly determined to strike back at the American carriers that had devastated their fleet. Behind them, the Hiryu's flight deck crews prepared a second strike force. Working with the mechanical precision that had made Japanese naval aviation legendary, the Japanese pilots flew with the skill and determination that had carried their nation to victory after victory, but they also carried the weight of desperate circumstances. Unlike the morning attacks on Pearl Harbor or Ceylon, when Japanese airmen had approached their targets with confidence born of superior numbers and tactical surprise, Kobayashi's small formation represented the last gasp of a dying strategy. At 12:03, the Japanese dive bombers found Task Force 17 centered around the USS Yorktown, the American carrier. Hastily repaired after damage suffered in the Battle of the Coral Sea just 1 month earlier, presented an inviting target as she recovered aircraft from the morning's strikes. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, leading the Yorktown's fighter defense, climbed to intercept with his F-4F Wildcats. Employing the innovative Thatch Weave formation that had proved effective against the superior Zero fighters, the attack on the Yorktown demonstrated both Japanese skill and American resilience. 3 bombs struck the carrier, causing significant damage and forcing her to slow to 6 knots as damage control parties fought fires and flooding. Yet the ship's survival, compared to the catastrophic destruction that had befallen the Japanese carriers, illustrated the superior damage control procedures and ship construction that would prove decisive throughout the Pacific campaign. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, commanding the Yorktown, directed his ship's defense with the calm professionalism that characterized American naval leadership. His damage control teams, trained in procedures developed through painful experience in earlier battles, quickly brought the fires under control and restored partial power to the ship. Within 2 hours, the Yorktown was making 20 knots and recovering aircraft, a feat that would have been impossible for the more lightly constructed Japanese carriers. The Hiryu's second strike, launched at 13:31 under Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, consisted of 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters, the last offensive capability remaining to the Japanese fleet. Tominaga, who had led the morning attack on Midway, flew with a wounded left arm and fuel gauges showing insufficient fuel for a return flight. His decision to continue the mission epitomized the code of sacrifice that defined Japanese naval aviation. This final attack achieved partial success, striking the Yorktown with 2 torpedoes that caused severe flooding and forced Captain Buckmaster to order abandon ship. Yet even this victory proved hollow, as American damage control expertise would later enable salvage crews to stabilize the carrier and begin towing her toward Pearl Harbor. The afternoon brought the inevitable American response. Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher, leading dive bombers from the Enterprise, located the Hiryu at 5:05 and began the attack that would complete the destruction of Japanese carrier aviation. 4 bombs struck the last Japanese carrier, starting fires that quickly spread through the ship's wooden flight deck and hangar spaces. Captain Yamaguchi, facing the same choice that had confronted his colleagues on the other carriers, chose to remain with his ship rather than transfer his flag to another vessel. His decision reflected the Japanese naval tradition of accepting responsibility for failure. But it also removed one of the most capable tactical commanders from the remaining Japanese fleet. As night fell on June 4th, ocean around Midway was littered with the burning remains of what had been the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled. For Japanese fleet carriers, representing the backbone of the Imperial Navy's air power, drifted as flaming hulks across the Pacific. With them died not only hundreds of irreplaceable pilots and aircrew, but the strategic initiative that Japan had held since Pearl Harbor, the mathematical precision of American intelligence had triumphed over Japanese tactical expertise, while superior damage control and industrial capacity had overcome initial disadvantages in pilot experience and aircraft performance. Dawn on June 5, 1942, revealed the full magnitude of Japan's naval catastrophe. The Four Fleet, carriers that had spearheaded every major Japanese victory since Pearl Harbor, now lay scattered across the Pacific as burning or sunken hulks. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Japanese naval strategy and the man who had warned his government that they had awakened a sleeping giant, faced the collapse of everything he had built. Aboard his flagship Yamato, positioned 300 miles northwest of the battle area, Yamamoto struggled with a decision that would define the remainder of the Pacific War. His remaining force's 11 battleships, including the mighty Yamato herself, along with numerous cruisers and destroyers still, possessed overwhelming surface superiority over the American fleet. A night action might yet salvage something from the disaster, but it would require closing to gun range without air cover against an enemy that had demonstrated mastery of carrier aviation. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Japan's entire Pacific strategy had been built around the concept of decisive battle using concentrated carrier air power. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their irreplaceable air groups represented not merely a tactical defeat, but the collapse of the fundamental assumption underlying Japanese naval planning. Commander Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, stood beside his admiral as reports continued to arrive from the scattered remnants of the Kido Butai. The Akagi, flagship of the force that had brought the United States into the war, would be scuttled by Japanese destroyers at dawn. The Kaga and Soryu had already disappeared beneath the waves, carrying with them decades of institutional knowledge and combat experience. Admiral Spruance, commanding the victorious American forces, demonstrated the calculated caution that would become his trademark throughout the Pacific campaign. Rather than pursuing the retreating Japanese fleet into what might prove to be a trap, he chose to consolidate his victory and preserve his forces for future operations. His decision reflected both tactical wisdom and strategic understanding of the broader war effort. The human cost of the battle became clear as rescue operations began throughout the area. Japanese losses totaled over 3,000 dead, including many of the most experienced pilots in the Imperial Navy. Captain Jisaku Okada of the Kaga, Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu, and Captain Taemon Yamaguchi of the Hiryu had all chosen to go down with their ships, following the ancient naval tradition of accepting responsibility for defeat. American casualties, while significant, paled in comparison to Japanese losses. The torpedo squadrons had been virtually wiped out in their heroic attacks, but the strategic victory more than justified their sacrifice. 307 Americans died at Midway, but their deaths had purchased a turning point in the Pacific War, as detailed in Historian Walter Lord's comprehensive account. Incredible victory, the battle's outcome fundamentally altered the strategic balance in the Pacific, shifting initiative from Japan to the United States for the remainder of the war. The psychological impact of defeat proved as devastating as the material losses. Japanese naval aviation had been built around the concept of spiritual superiority over Western opponents, combined with technical excellence and tactical innovation. The destruction at Midway shattered this confidence and initiated a defensive mindset that would plague Japanese operations for the remainder of the war. Emperor Hirohito, receiving news of the disaster in his palace in Tokyo, understood immediately that the war had entered a new phase. easy victories that had marked the first 6 months of conflict were over, replaced by the grim prospect of defensive warfare against an increasingly powerful enemy. His question to the naval staff, how could this have happened, would echo through Japanese strategic planning for the remainder of the conflict. The battle's conclusion on June 6 saw Admiral Yamamoto ordering a general retreat of all Japanese forces. The invasion of Midway was cancelled, the Aleutian operations were scaled back. The entire Japanese fleet began the long withdrawal toward home waters. The strategic initiative in the Pacific had passed permanently to the United States. For the American forces, victory at Midway represented vindication of their code-breaking efforts, tactical innovations, and industrial capacity. The ability to position their fleet with mathematical precision at the point of maximum advantage had demonstrated that intelligence warfare could triumph over superior numbers and experience. The retreat of the Japanese fleet marked not merely the end of a battle, but the beginning of the end of Japanese expansion in the Pacific. The morning sun of June 7th illuminated empty waters where the greatest naval battle of the Pacific War had reached its conclusion. The Japanese fleet, once the terror of the Pacific, limped westward toward home ports, carrying with it the shattered remnants of a strategy that had dominated half the world's largest ocean for 6 months. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood alone on the bridge of the Yamato, contemplating the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen his carefully constructed naval strategy. The architect of Pearl Harbor understood better than anyone that the loss of 4 fleet carriers represented far more than a tactical defeat. It marked the end of Japan's ability to conduct offensive operations across the vast distances of the Pacific. The strategic implications were staggering. Japan's entire war plan had been predicated on achieving decisive victory through concentrated carrier strikes, followed by negotiated peace with a demoralized America. The destruction of the Kido Butai meant that Japan would now be forced to fight a defensive war against an enemy with vastly superior industrial capacity and unlimited strategic depth. In Washington, Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, studied the initial battle reports with grim satisfaction. The victory at Midway represented the first decisive defeat inflicted on Japanese forces since Pearl Harbor. But King's analytical mind was already focusing on the strategic opportunities that victory had created. The Japanese Navy, stripped of its offensive capability, could no longer prevent American advances across the Central Pacific. The human cost of Japanese defeat extended far beyond the immediate casualties. The Imperial Navy had lost not only ships and aircraft, but the core of institutional knowledge that had made it the world's premier naval air force. Veteran pilots like Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Iteya, who had led fighters over Pearl Harbor, lay at the bottom of the Pacific along with the tactical expertise they represented. Captain Mitsuo Fukita, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor but missed Midway due to illness, would later write that the battle marked the beginning of the end for Japanese naval aviation. The comment reflected not merely tactical analysis, but recognition that Japan had lost the strategic initiative permanently. The aftermath revealed the fundamental flaws in Japanese strategic thinking that had been masked by early victories. The Imperial Navy's focus on decisive battle had prevented development of the defensive capabilities and industrial infrastructure necessary for prolonged warfare. While American shipyards were already laying down dozens of new aircraft carriers, Japan lacked both the resources and strategic vision to replace its losses. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, understood that Midway represented an opportunity rather than an end. His post-battle planning immediately focused on maintaining pressure on Japanese forces while building up American strength for future offensive operations. The strategic initiative gained at Midway would be leveraged into a campaign that would carry American forces across the Pacific to Japan itself. The Japanese response to defeat revealed the institutional rigidity that would plague their war effort for the remainder of the conflict. Rather than acknowledging the fundamental changes in the strategic situation, Imperial headquarters continued planning, based on assumptions of Japanese superiority that had been shattered in the waters around Midway. The death toll from the battle extended beyond those who died in the flames of burning carriers. Japanese naval aviation, stripped of its most experienced pilots and tactical leaders, would never again achieve the level of excellence that had characterized operations from Pearl Harbor through the Indian Ocean raids. Who would fill the empty cockpits lacked both the training time and combat experience of their predecessors. For the United States, victory at Midway provided not only strategic advantage, but psychological vindication. The codebreakers who had provided the intelligence advantage, the industrial workers who had repaired the Yorktown in record time, and the pilots who had pressed home their attacks despite overwhelming odds, had all contributed to a victory that proved American determination and capability. The battle's conclusion marked the end of Japanese expansion and the beginning of the long retreat that would culminate in the surrender. Ceremony aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay 3 years later, Admiral Yamamoto's prediction that Japan could run wild for 6 months had proved remarkably accurate. Japanese expansion had lasted exactly 6 months and 1 day from Pearl Harbor to Midway. As the last Japanese ships disappeared over the western horizon, the waters around Midway returned to their accustomed quiet. Yet beneath that deceptive calm lay the wreckage of a strategy and the graves of an empire's ambitions. The hidden strength of American intelligence, industrial capacity, and fighting spirit had been revealed, and with it died the Japanese dream of Pacific domination. The Battle of Midway was over, but its consequences would echo across the Pacific for the remainder of World War II, fundamentally altering the course of history in the world's largest ocean.